Okay, awesome. I think the recording is going. I'm going to have a quick chat with everybody today. This is one of my favorite topics. Haha, just kidding. But we're going to talk about inversion and diversion in the cannabis space. Let's get rocking. Share my screen here. I got a whole bunch of fun stuff on here, but let's run through the slides. We're going to talk about inversion, diversion, the myths and the legends of what inversion and diversion means for any kind of regulated, could work for any regulated crop, right? Like we tend to work a lot with regulated cannabis, but it could be working for hemp, could be working for coffee, it could be working for fish, it could be working for cocoa trade for chocolates, right? Lots of these things. Maybe you want to talk about organic supply chain, farm to table kind of mechanisms. All of those sort of exist with a little bit of a track and trace like system. And when you have that track and trace like system, that's when you have that inversion and diversion. Let's just do a little line here. This little channel right here, represents, I would say, our supply chain. And then down here at the end, this is the end user, the consumer, or something like this. That's general population. And then I'll just pick another color over here. And this is probably where something, starts in the universe, like a producer or something like this. And we have this channel all the way through on the inversion and diversion. Diversion is tracked material that is supposed to be inside of this supply chain, supposed to run in this narrow corridor all the way through, exits the system somehow in a way that it's not really supposed to. There's opportunities for stuff to leave the system. In the regulated cannabis universe, for example, waste material gets created, and there is a process that you remove that material from the system through some record keeping, right? But that's not really diversion. That's something leaves the system, but it leaves the system and then sort of stops. Let's just pick another point here. At some point in time, bad material just leaves the system and it's done forever, and it goes into the earth, right? Ground is a symbol we used to use a long time ago. So sometimes some material just does that. That's not diversion. And then inversion is untracked, random material from across the universe makes it into the supply chain. For example, this producer, they may have some material, maybe a friend of theirs has some items available from the, untracked cocoa plants. Maybe they don't have the good records for their organic growth material or their which farm they came from, or in the case of cannabis, maybe we have some cannabis from an illegal farm or an unregulated farm or an unlicensed farm, and they bring that material into this supply chain. And as you go through the supply chain, there's other operators who do all of these kinds of things properly. You've got a manufacturing kind of person that's in the middle. So it could be that some of this, interesting material comes into the manufacturer and then becomes part of the supply chain as the goods continue to flow down through the manufacturer. So that's the inversion side. Diversion, inversion. And all the track and trace systems, they're designed to try to prevent this kind of stuff from happening. There's some big problems with it. Right here, let's just, talk about some of the assumptions that track and trace and a good system with tight control for inversion and diversion makes. These are things that they make about assumptions that these kinds of systems make about the universe. They think that everything is trackable or can be tracked, things like this. It also assumes that material is consistent. I guess when I take a step back, when it says everything is tracked, they also sort of have the assumption that it makes sense to also try to track everything. This is why we get to circumstances where folks are putting a tag on an individual tree. For cannabis, it doesn't make much sense since it grows so fast. There's this harvest over and over. If you have a large farm with apple trees that are there for years and years and years, it does make sense in that scenario to maybe identify each tree in the orchard and keep track of them that way. But for Crops that last less than 6 months, they grow up, they're done. Like, what are we doing with tracking every single tree like that, right? Canopy is probably, and by probably I mean absolutely, a better way to regulate material production in that space. It also assumes material is consistent, and it assumes that grading is consistent. That consistency there is a big problem. If you grow anything, you know that one year your trees, your crop will produce some amount of material. Another time your crop will produce a lesser or a greater amount of material, even when it is the same genetics. Maybe there's a little more consistency with indoor. That's certainly what the indoor farmer would have you believe. But even on indoor crops, some genetics, some things don't always, it doesn't go every single time. Plus, the eyeball who's saying this is grade A material and we should classify it this way, and this is grade B material and we should classify it this way, it's not the same eyeball. There's not a standard bit of grading on that kind of aspect. Another assumption that works in the track and trace universe, don't see it, I don't see it very frequently in the regulated cannabis, but in other crops, you will see a tamper-proof package. You know, like they'll put bushels and bushels of material in a container, and then they put in the logbook of the track and trace system that we've put this much material into the container, and they close and they lock the container. Maybe they put a little brake seal on the thing, you know, a little wire seal. You have to cut the wire to then gain access to the container. And that way, when whoever receives it knows this material, whatever that sender told me was in there, made it all the way over here. There's also this assumption in track and trace that you have a picture of complete supply chain data, which is difficult, especially for international goods. But even in the cannabis space, and you know, by all definitions, much, much smaller than global international trade, because it's all just in like one state or one country. Those systems don't have the complete supply chain data really anyway. You would want to have representations of like the lot's family, that inventory item, where did it come from, what other source materials were used to put it together. Got this other problem where there's some material is not part of the track and trace supply chain. Think about like sugar that I'm adding to my gummies, but it needs to get introduced into materials that are part of this regulated supply chain. You know, that stuff is not typically part of a regulatory body's data set. Anyways, everything is tracked. What about clones and seeds? Like, who's counted actually 10,000 seeds that you have 10,000 seeds? You would say you would have some kind of quantity of seeds, or maybe you say, I have a bag of seeds that weighs this much, and call that good, you know, and then if the regulator cared about it, they'd be able to come in and weigh that package and, you know, see that that's right. Is the regulator going to come in and count out a whole bunch of seeds? Again, once you've designated some material as waste, you sort of just say, well, and now we have this finish process or this destruction process, sort of just disappears from the system at that point. Sometimes on this tracking of the system, and depending on someone's timing, when they put in all of the moisture loss from this curing and harvest, hang it, cure it, now it's dried, that whole process, there's a bunch of loss in there, loss that's inconsistent, loss that could be, I've chosen to do this, or I've chosen to pull it down and make it part of my inventory before we're at a particular moisture level because of, you know, reasons. Oil processors may want a wetter material, or they maybe want a drier material if you're going to try to manufacture a bunch of pre-rolls or something, you know, manufacturer's choice. But those are inconsistent across the whole system. So even if we're plugging those numbers in, which they're not always getting in there, those numbers also don't really have a basis to be a comp for another number in the system. We've got this consistency problem. You know, we're sort of just touching on it. Let's hit it the same. Not all these flowers are the same. Not every plant's the same, even in the same genetic group. You know, you could take one of your happy trees and you could make a bunch of cuttings off of that, and you could get those cuttings started, and even those cuttings won't produce exactly what their mother did, and those cuttings themselves would be inconsistent across those trees. You know, and then when we go to grade this material, the the track and trace systems typically have folks classify materials grade A, grade B, grade C. Track and trace for cannabis, track and trace for things like organic farming. We've got our good corn, we've got our grade A, we've got our grade B, kind of stuff like this. These potatoes are destined for the shelf. These potatoes are destined to become potato chips, kind of a situation for grading the material. And some of that stuff is known and is reasonably well defined and regulated. So, another little bit there. Tamper proof. I wish we would see this, but there's not a lot of tamper proofing inside of the facility itself. They make you put cameras, but if a pound of wet material left the room, and by the time you go to record the weight again of the material, you have a dry weight in there and there's a whole bunch of spread, and now that thing becomes just like a minor deviation from your previous ones, you'd hardly even notice something like that. So that kind of stuff, hard to track, especially when we have inconsistency, especially when we have deviation from naturally occurring materials, all of that stuff. Bulk plant matter is typically not stored in tamper-proof packaging or even in the facility. Those, like a zip tie would probably be sufficient to say, oh, I've sealed this up and I put a good zip tie on there. But proper tamper-proof packaging, they have that little wire wraparound thing, goes in the little lead ball or whatever, and you can stamp a number on there or things like this. You can, fix. There's even advanced smart locks, which I think is a little bit of overkill. Sealed packaging for your bulk process materials, and then also bundles of your packaged materials, right? We made a whole bunch of 3.5 gram packages, or we made a whole bunch of candy bars, and now we're going to ship it to somebody over there. We need that to be, tamper evident somehow, and that does not exist too well for cannabis in the USA. And then we've got all this issue with the supply chain data, recording the identity from a tree. Maybe it should just be a crop. We've got raw plant matter coming in, like the harvested materials. It may or may not go through to become net plant material, that's destined for production. Bulk materials sometimes are missing out on their additives coming in. The laboratory results may or may not be part of these systems. Unfortunately, it's possible to game the system on an inversion or diversion process and then just put inverted material into the same bundle with some tested material, and it now looks legit through the whole process. And if your numbers are not too abnormal, it would be hard for a system to detect that, especially given the fact that the material itself behaves pretty inconsistently. The last stage of it, though, once a retailer receives a bunch of material, when the retailer receives their 100 packages of 5 gram flour packages, now we've got actually some place where the system at that end of the supply chain, they've got a consistent package. It's always the same container of maybe something different inside, but I have the same container. And I know I have 100 of those. I received them and I sell through them out and can keep track of that inventory pretty accurately. And the only spot you're going to have a diversion from something like at that retail stage is when it would just be theft. And their existing inventory controls work fantastic for that. There were some big old gaps in this whole thing that RFID could somehow prevent all of this. I don't think that it does. Having a scannable tag of particular type on the thing doesn't prevent inversion or diversion. And in fact, we can see, what was it just recently? Diversion, something like this. There was I found it here recently. Metric is doing this thing. They say that RFID is supposed to stop the whole thing. They've got some person who is a whistleblower there who's saying that, Metric knows that RFID doesn't track that stuff, doesn't prevent it, but they also say it's not even their job to try to do that, even though that was the pitch from the beginning. RFID, you can track everything. Here's another one, and every state that's running metric, they have, here's the one for how is it going to affect Maine, here's the one where how it's going to affect California, here's one for what does this mean for the whistleblower case, what does that mean for Michigan. The whole thing started off in Oregon, although this lawsuit now has been dismissed. There's a bunch of, it raises still a bunch of valid points. The harvest and cure process is for almost any track and trace or controlled crop, regulated crop, or is really a tough spot, whether that's coffee beans or cannabis. Does not really, material can enter the system and exit the system at that point like ever so easily. Again, with the flexibility of the inconsistency of plant matter to produce. We do have a grading problem in some of those things where this material could get reclassified and then moved out of the system in a clever way, even if it was or should have been grade A staying in the system. Oh, we'll just call it waste. Now this large number of material disappears from our system. We don't have to track it, for example. And then there are also these gaps on the conversion where new material is introduced into the product, right? I'm making gummies, so I have my original oil, and then I have my candy goo that I'm mixing together with it. Well, I can say, I've done this with the candy goo, but you can also just sneak in a little bit more oil when you're doing that. And in your conversion process, you would just say, oh, I consumed all of my oil, and it should have been making me 100 units, but now I've made myself 200 units, except the numbers aren't that clear. You would see that as, oh, I usually make 10,000 units and now I've made 12,000 units, just juicing that stuff up sort of a little bit. And all of this, to prevent inversion, diversion in a track and trace system with a huge amount of gaps in there. And then it hardly helps at all when these officers are actually getting a bust of these farms. They're locating a thing because they can see, here I see a cannabis farm. It's not in this registered database, like in the open THC universe, we call that the directory. The officer would look it up in the directory and go, oh, I don't see this one. Then you can just go to the facility and ask to see their license. Oh, you guys don't have the license. The universe is up to date. Your paperwork's not in order. You guys, now we know that this is, not a good crop. And this wasn't something that came about because of the diligence of the data analysis of the supply chain track and trace. This was just, oh, we observed it. We knew where there was a registered license. It's the same effect as if you have a liquor store with no license to sell the liquor, or a restaurant selling liquor with no liquor license. A responding officer, whoever's responsible for enforcement, can just look up the database, not of every tree they have, not of their this, not of their this, not of their this. Just, do you have the ability to have a license? Here's another one, 105,000 cannabis plants, just for a reference. That's $42,000 worth of plant tags in the metric universe for the farmers that got to pay for those RFID tags. So here's one in California. There was the other one we've just shown. Here's another one in California. They go to an illegal marijuana store. Sometimes they call it a trap shop, right? They go to this trap shop, and the trap shop, you can just tell, hey, you're selling cannabis, but you don't have a cannabis license. This is obviously not allowed. Let's close it down. Here it is in California again. Here it's happening on Long Island in New York. Here it's happening in Canada, and they see this and they say, oh, you have these materials, you have these professional looking grow ops, but you're not licensed. Complaining witness. Oh, here's an article about diversion and stuff like this, a cross-sectional analysis. This thing is very, very used, but diverted use was reported by 72% of age 35 and 55 users. This means loads of people are, oh no, sorry, that's about their work. And then let's see, step and diversion. Oh, this is just conversion. They're just talking about how that works. Here we have another bill that's going to stop illegal inversion and diversion in Washington State. They passed this a little bit ago to regularly audit the data in a system with the goal of identifying, and Washington State's got a homebrew cannabis reporting system that doesn't even keep track of the lot's family. So finding inversion and diversion in a supply chain data set that doesn't have relationships in it is pretty much impossible. But they have to do this. They have to audit outliers or anomalies in data for inconsistencies in reporting. And again, you have an incomplete data set with an inconsistent methodology for putting data into that data set, and now you're going to try to use it for detailed analysis. It's not really going to work. Cannabis products, here's another, folks. They say we should solve this problem, creating laws for the commercial illicit markets, well-established pathways. And this is a long one from accce.org. I'll probably try to keep some of the links in this video. There's another on green culture trying to talk about how to prevent this whole diversion. So for the business operator, that's all about keeping those tight controls, keeping those audit controls on the stuff. Who has access to the drying room? Only trusted people. Make sure your materials are consistently graded. Good luck on something like that. Make sure that only trusted participants are, putting information into the system, and only trusted participants are handling that material. So again, lots of complexities in track and trace, lots of complexities around inversion and diversion. Nearly impossible to stop. Even in 2025, it happens for cigarettes and alcohol. So why would cannabis be any different? But we've got a significant amount of regulations on it that all is claiming to try to fix that. Or here, we passed some legislation that says try to get blood from a rock, try to get some good data out of a system that doesn't let you get good data in the first place, because legislators are sort of imagining that it's possible, but that's not how things work. And so unfortunately it really can't go all the way back to being able to stop the problem. And all that regulation right now hasn't really stopped the problem. All the regulation right now is done is put burden on all the farmers, put burden on all the participants in the regulated space. All the illegal stuff is being picked up not by clever analysis, but being picked up by law enforcement, just identifying facilities that aren't in the list of licensed locations. Easy peasy. Same as they're working right now for cigarettes and vape and tobacco and alcohol products. Thanks.